Welcome to the 12th and final InGuardians webinar for 2019. Today is going to be an interesting roundtable discussion. We've got a number of our team here to discuss kind of Infosec predictions for 2020. In this process, we'll be giving predictions, we'll be discussing those predictions, maybe even reminiscing a little bit over the past couple of years leading up to this. I would also like to invite our illustrious audience to submit questions and your own predictions, through the questions panel, and we will get to them kind of towards the end of the webinar. So first off, here on the next slide, we have our list of panelists. We have Dave Mayer, Rob CurtinSeufert, we've got Jarrod Frates, we've got Jay Beale, and myself. We may have an appearance by Larry Pesci, but for now, this is our panel, and we're going to start with Dave. Dave, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a prediction for 2020?
Hi, this is Dave Mayer, Senior Security Consultant, Head of Red Team Operations, and my prediction for 2020, and something we'll see more of, and we've seen much of it throughout 2019, is continuing of cloud services that aren't locked down properly. One example of that is Active Directory federated services, Azure AD. Many clients aren't aware of the separate permissions between the two, and gaining access to Azure AD can allow you to enumerate a lot of internal information that they may not think is actually published within Azure AD when they're just setting it up to have those federated services available with single sign-on. That's my first prediction for this year.
And Dave, I hope you don't mind me asking, but it sounds almost as if by saying that there's going to be an increase in this, that this is something that you come across, in your day-to-day operations.
Yeah, it definitely is something we've come across, and we're coming across it more and more, even now, smaller organizations, just to be able to access many third-party, integrate with Active Directory, Azure AD applications, proliferating that way, which is just growing the setup and also the confusion and problems that may lie within.
Oh, wow. It's definitely a difficult thing, operating a small business, just dealing with, everything from finances to clients and deliverables and everything else, then, and securing your own internal infrastructure. But at least from what I've looked at, there's very little out there, in my opinion, for small businesses in terms of how to do this securely. Have you found something similar, or have you found, any really good resources? Not that we have to list them now, but.
I don't have them handy now, but it is something that can be limited so that, say, one user gets compromised via Azure AD, by default, you can dump many of the users and groups out of the internal AD setup, but there's ways to configure that so that only the user can only view their own information, not all of the information within Active Directory, and it's something that requires definitely a good amount of research and configuration and testing before implementing.
Oh, wow. So one of the things that I suggest that we do with some of these predictions is that after this webinar, we'll put those predictions out on Twitter through the @InGuardians Twitter handle, and we'll follow up to those tweets with some of those resources, if that's possible. So just opening up to a group discussion, does anybody else want to comment on Dave's prediction there that we will see an increase in insecure cloud deployment?
Sure. This is Jarrod Frates, Senior Security Consultant with InGuardians. I think a big part of the problem is, or the challenge rather, is that traditionally when you're setting up your architecture, you build your domain controller and then you add other services on as necessary. You don't have that approach when it comes to the cloud services. If you sign up for Azure AD, typically you're going through Office 365, and now in addition to the AD piece, you're also getting SharePoint and Exchange, and teams and all the other pieces that come along with it. They just sort of they're sort of dumped in your lap, and it's a lot for especially small companies to try and figure out how it's all supposed to work together and how they're supposed to lock it down.
Yeah, thanks. That makes sense.
Yeah, this is Jay Beale. Oh, Rob, go ahead.
This is Rob CurtinSeufert here, and when we're doing external network penetration tests, we have used these multiple times to enumerate and password spray and get internal network access through, more specifically, Azure Active Directory. And there are, when for example, setting up Outlook web application and some other pieces that Jarrod touched on, we're seeing a lot of clients just move, clone their Active Directory environment into Azure, and that is the problem inherent with Azure Active Directory in particular, because we're able to use PowerShell to connect to the Azure Active Directory environment, enumerate through the users and groups, and just pick up and target whoever, whatever group we want to. For example, the default password policy in Azure Active Directory is separate than your internal network password policy, and that is after 10 invalid password attempts, it locks out the external network access for 1 minute. And so we're gonna, as more and more people are moving to Office 365 or Microsoft 365 in other environments, that's the piece that is being missed drastically. It's the configuration and locking down of those environments.
Yeah, definitely, and that's been kind of a problem, for a while over there. Totally agree. Jay?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me in terms of more and more kind of simple vulnerabilities in companies' use of cloud services, I think it's got to increase just with the number of organizations that are moving to cloud providers, and there's a whole lot of things that used to be internal that are going external, that are going onto a cloud provider, and so it's much easier for them to be found out there on the internet. Because we have this, it makes me think about, there are metrics for, if your application has this many lines of code, it's going to have this many security vulnerabilities and this many bugs, and I've got to think there's some kind of analog to that with, if you've taken this many things that were inside a data center and put them onto cloud services, especially if you're in the infrastructure as a service side, you're going to some small percentage, but it's big when you multiply that by the number of things you've moved, are going to have a vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, good point. And it was always some of those things that we looked at, kind of coming to this from kind of a 25-year background or 30-year background in this, that we used to have applications that we were testing that had 2 developers or 10 developers, for instance, and they had been those developers for the lifetime of the application, and now we have these web applications that over time have thousands and thousands of developers that have added their own little flair, or they take building blocks of other things that might be secure, but then couple them with their own kind of homegrown things that haven't been tested. So it's always that it's that one little small flaw that brings down the house. Well, thank you. And we're going to do this in kind of a round robin style. So next up, well, let's go to Jay Beale for his prediction for 2020.
Sure. So My prediction for 2020 in information security is we're going to see more and more cloud native, and that you can think of that as Kubernetes. You can think of that as containerization. Anything that comes down to software-defined data centers, we're going to see a ton. We're going to see a ton more information security work. That means vulnerabilities, it means incidents, it means audits, it means blue teams coming up to speed on cloud native and figuring out how to protect this thing that their organization is often adopting right now, and the blue teams are going to find out that they own it and own responsibility for it in a few months or a year down the road. And for me, behind that are a couple graphics that we'll publish on InGuardians Twitter feed. But the first is, the first is just looking at the organization that owns Kubernetes. It's called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's a sister organization to the Linux Foundation, and it was its first major project was Kubernetes. They got it from Google, but in that cloud native area, all the stuff that goes into, think of it as all the stuff around containers and around Kubernetes, there are there's a landscape page on the CNCF on that Cloud Native Computing Foundation's website, and that landscape page talks to you about the size of the market cap of all of these companies. They have 1,296 companies, each creating some kind of technology. These are just the places that are making a technology, not even the services companies. These are companies that are making or providing a technology. 1,296 companies with a combined market capitalization of a little over $15 trillion, with their funding at over $63 billion. So the cloud native landscape, it's a lot bigger than Docker and Kubernetes. Like around 1,300 companies, the people have made big bets on. There's a huge move. There's a huge move to cloud native, and there's been a huge move to Kubernetes. We're going to see a lot more work for blue teams to do, a lot more work for all of us to start catching up on it and keeping up on it. There's one other graphic that we'll put on the Twitter feed as well, but it basically shows the percentage of companies that are in three major cloud providers, AWS, Azure, and GCP, that are running Kubernetes. And in 2017, if we're looking at Azure, it was almost half of Azure. It was almost a quarter of AWS's customers were using this. At this point, in 2019, that number moved up to almost 50% of the customers in AWS are running Kubernetes. More than almost 80% of the customers on Azure are running Kubernetes, and on Google's cloud platform on GCP, that number seems to be inching its way towards 85%. So we've got these color bars, but the short version is it's been growing, and at this point, basically almost a majority of customers in AWS are using Kubernetes, and a wide, what I'll call supermajority for anyone following politics, of Microsoft Azure and GCP's customers are using Kubernetes, according to a Datadog survey. So there's going to be a ton. There's going to be a ton to do, and for me, like seeing that, part of what also outside of these numbers, part of what I base my predictions on there is that in InGuardians clients, we have a number of clients that aren't tech companies, they're large companies, and we've done a ton of penetration testing or red team work for them that's been so much against Windows heavy environments, and yet they've come to us in the last 1 or 2 years and said, turns out we have a major project and it involves Kubernetes, or it involves another container platform, and and we just found out we have it, or it's just starting to, our deployment's just starting to mature, and we need someone to look at it. And I think for the, outside of us operating as a service company, just all of the company's blue teams, I keep talking to people who are basically saying, yeah, I just got told that we have, that we have a containerization infrastructure, and I need to protect it, and I don't know anything about it, so I got to go learn. So for me, that's the prediction. We'll all have a bunch more to learn, and this stuff will, and this area is going to keep expanding really quickly, and far more than we realized until it hits each of us individually.
Jay, we absolutely see this every day at InGuardians. When I reached out to our sales group to find out kind of what their predictions for 2020 were, their number one prediction was a continued increase in cloud native testing requests, especially with surrounding Kubernetes. I would just like, before I open it up to further discussion, I'd like to ask a follow-on question as to, it seems that in our industry we have a very limited group of people that are Kubernetes or cloud native savvy. Granted, for our business that's a great thing, but we need to hire people too. Where do people go to educate themselves on penetration testing or blue team defending of Kubernetes and related environments?
Wow, that's a hard question. That's a difficult question. So trainings in this are just starting to come out and mature in the last year or two. I teach a class at SANS that has this as a major topic area. I mean, I teach a class at Black Hat that has this as a major topic area, and there's at least one other there. SANS is very recently also starting to do shorter trainings that will grow into longer trainings. A lot of us, honestly, a lot of people out there are self-taught. And by self-taught, it's just like the rest of information security. Like at least I've been doing this, and most of the, many of us at InGuardians have been doing this for so long that there weren't information security, master's or bachelor's degrees when we started. There are now, but but for the most part, this field is self-taught.
Get off my lawn.
Yeah, sorry about that. But
No,
yeah,
no.
you just honestly, you follow your, if you're interested in this, if you're, you get passionate about this, you can teach yourself. You can find a heck of a lot of talks. I would say YouTube has been wonderful, and KubeCon has been a great conference. And the nice thing is that there are already a few years worth of great talks there that'll tell you a lot about not just Kubernetes, but about this whole ecosystem. Those of you who have a Linux background at all, you're gonna have a huge advantage. It's not as scary or as foreign as it sounds, I guess, is the biggest thing I'd want to say. It's just another technology. I think, and it may just be that I don't know mainframes well enough, but I think learning Kubernetes is a lot easier than learning a mainframe at this point. Even though it gets pretty broad. So.
And this is awesome. And before I get thrown off the platform for leading the witness, but I seem to recall that there is a vulnerable distribution that people can play around with for Kubernetes.
Fair enough.
And that there may or may not be an attack tool or two that they could kind of try their hands at.
Absolutely. Take a look at InGuardians website and InGuardians Twitter feed, and then my Twitter feed as well. You're going to find two things in particular that folks at InGuardians have built. One of them is an attack tool for Kubernetes that needs more developers to work on it, because there's a lot more to do. There's a lot more that it can do, that it'll be able to do than it can do right now. But there's good stuff it does right now. It's called Frates. The other thing we built that is pretty mature is a intentionally vulnerable, think of it as a capture the flag Kubernetes cluster, and it's called Bustacube, and that one's bustacube.com, but you can do a Google search for it, of course. And Bustacube is an intentionally vulnerable Kubernetes cluster with a couple scenarios you can go through, and there are walkthroughs online, so you can use that to actually, instead of just watching talks or reading slides about how to attack, you can watch those talks and read those slides and do it against a real cluster. Do the walkthrough against the cluster scenarios first as well. And again, that's also an open source project, so please feel free to come help, especially if you want to create a scenario for people to use. Yeah, I think that's the biggie. And I guess the last one is, if you want us to tell you, if you want the InGuardians folks, we have a bunch of people here who who beat up on Kubernetes. If you want advice on how to learn and how to get stronger, we're happy to give it, especially because, as Mike said, this service area, this field is, this subfield of InfoSec, it's growing, and we're all going to need people to hire. So I think one of the easiest ways we can help with that is to teach as much as we can. I guess the other one for me is, like I said, YouTube. So we have a number of Kubernetes talks out there, and there are some other great ones as well. So hit YouTube and you'll find them.
Yeah, a flood tide rises all boats. Absolutely. Just to open this up to discussion, does anybody have any add-ons or other things they want to discuss about kind of the rise of cloud native services and the need to test and defend them? All righty then. Thank you so much for that, Jay. If I could push this over to Rob. Rob, why don't you take it away with one of your main predictions for 2020?
Awesome. So one of my predictions for 2020 is, due to the fact that there are more and more command and control frameworks written based in PowerShell or .NET, C#, that we will see a decrease in those based malware in the wild. More and more eyes are turning to C#, .NET, PowerShell. More protections are going in place. Microsoft is updating PowerShell, which breaks backwards compatibility that a lot of these need to handle some of the more unsafe calls. And so my prediction for 2020, or one of them, is that PowerShell-based malware will slowly decrease, hitting the apex later in the year. Yeah.
And what do you think the outcome of that is going to be? Just because it is so ubiquitous.
The outcome of that is part of my other predictions, is that we will see more esoteric-based droppers. But by esoteric, I mean esoteric languages. So, for example, recently we've been seeing an uptick of Delphi-based droppers using to drop other malware written in other languages, such as Go and C++. So we're going to see more esoteric droppers and more conventional languages used to write and use these implants for command control.
Now that's really interesting. Just opening it up to discussion to folks. Does anybody have things to add or subtract to that or debate?
Yeah, this is Dave. So I think Rob is right with that. We've seen a lot just with the public tool releases recently, with more things going to things written in .NET or other. I've seen some in Go as well for the command and control for the payloads and running those on systems, and just a migration away from what's been the standard. So I think we'll just see a more diverse group of payloads and command and control malware out there, whether it be from groups like ourselves writing it, doing information security testing, or from malicious threat actors out there changing up what they're using as well.
And Dave, just to follow up on that, and Rob as well, but do you think that one of those primary pushes is, just the fact that, PowerShell's been out for a long time. We've been, abusing the heck out of it, and there are many tools out there on the market today that are really geared towards picking that up and detecting it and blocking it.
I think we've seen an uptick in the number of tools for detecting malicious PowerShell and stopping it. But typically, this is where things really start to divide, is based on the size of the organization. There's a lot of EDRs or other business software out there where you need to buy a minimum number of licenses for it, and that might start to cause a divide between those and which malware is used for which type of organization. And I think until we start seeing the point where you can start buying some of those products that do a really good job for smaller organizations, that we'll start to see that divide between like PowerShell-based malware for smaller organizations that just don't have the manpower to go and tune their systems for, because 150 people, versus larger organizations that have those dedicated people.
Yeah, and this is Rob here. This is a direct reflection of just the sheer amount of frameworks that are based in that. So even though we've been abusing it for years, as there's more and more publicly available tools that abuse C# and abuse the .NET framework, that's why I feel more eyes are turning towards it and slowing it down.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we saw. Sorry to interrupt there. We saw. Now this is almost 20 years ago. We saw where it was very, very difficult to get clients to block Microsoft service ports at their firewall, at their perimeter, right? And we're talking about, ports, 135, 137, 139, and 445, and then all of a sudden we had, 5 or 6 worms in a row that essentially exploited this, and then you started having, ISPs starting to block that, at the ISP level, for example. So it does seem that that's kind of the nature of the beast. As soon as that we have more and more abuse, and in this case, more tools, more frameworks, more people using them. I mean, we've seen where we go into a customer either on a penetration test or incident response, and we find that they've been compromised, and that the attacker, who is a not legitimate, pen tester, for example, so the attacker is using a lot of the same frameworks and tools that that InfoSec practitioners would use.
And I think one of the things that has let the PowerShell become such a major vector to begin with is that Microsoft really kind of got things moving with PowerShell v2, which didn't have a whole lot of protection built into it. And as they started adding more protections into it in the later versions, they didn't really do enough to push developers to move to the newer stuff. Part of it was compatibility with older versions of Windows that didn't automatically come with newer versions of PowerShell installed. But part of it was just sort of simplicity of relying on what everybody knew, what worked. Why move on? It's sort of the same issue that Python 2 ran into for a long time. And even though Python 2 support is coming to an end here in just a few days, it's not going away anytime soon. And the same thing with PowerShell v2. if Microsoft can get people to start moving off of it and get to the point where enterprises can outright block use of PowerShell v2 or anything old, make sure that they have to be on PowerShell v5 or the upcoming v7, and that's going to make it a lot harder to make use of PowerShell for malware purposes, and it's going to force the attackers off onto new platforms.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And and just because certain people can't be here to defend themselves, Pearl's still here, pal.
You know it.
Yeah. So what I see, and is for 2020, I think kind of the most kind of blasé predictions. Certainly, we're still going to see major organizations, city governments, hospitals, get attacked and taken over by ransomware. We're still going to see an increase in development in kind of ransomware capabilities, as well as the capabilities to essentially recover from those. I think that we've already seen a number of very large customers really turn towards disaster recovery and business continuity to get past those rather than trying something technical once that has happened. I think that we're going to see kind of an increase in incident response with regards to kind of large cloud capabilities. This mainly is because not only are people deploying them in mass, as we've already talked about, people are testing them, and in this testing, they're going to find cloud instances that have already been compromised. If the number of people that have the experience in testing the cloud environments is a small kind of number of our field, the number of people that actually have experience doing incident response on those style environments are even fewer. Any discussion?
I wish I could be that optimistic about things, but at this point, I think we still have, especially in government fields, we still have too much in the way of legacy applications that, in many cases, the original vendors are no longer there. They're no longer around. Some of them literally have died. I've actually run into that a couple of times, and I think there's still going to be some very, very large swaths of fairly juicy targets for attackers to go after. I think some companies, especially those that are relying more on starting to rely on cyber insurance and are finding that their claims are getting turned down because they don't have enough protections. That's starting to become a thing a major thing in the policies. I think they're going to get more serious about it, but I think we're a long way from seeing hospitals and pretty much anything in the medical field. I think, and governments. I think it's going to be a long time before we stop seeing them in the news on a regular basis.
Yeah, and just to clarify, if I wasn't clear to begin with, is that my prediction is that we're going to continue to see an increase in the number of hospitals and city governments and otherwise that are affected by ransomware and those things.
Can we actually? I'd love to ask, not to lead anybody, but yeah, this month was kind of crazy in that we were halfway through the month and we had four different city governments in the news having been hit with ransomware. It was Pensacola, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, Galt, California, and I don't know exactly how to say it, St. Lucia, Florida, or St. Lucie. What makes city governments so prone or so targeted? I mean, which is it? Are they more vulnerable? Are they more targeted, or both?
So having worked in a government position, specifically in a county before, I can tell you the two things are legacy software that just sits around forever, whether it's supported or not. But also a big problem is pay. The especially the smaller city and county governments, they can't afford to pay out the salaries that are considered market, and it's hard to, in many cases, it's hard to even pull them in. Texas, where I'm at, has, I forget how many counties we have, but I think it's actually a couple of hundred counties. It's north of 100 anyway. A lot of these counties are very small. Their budgets are very, very tiny. They are out pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The nearest major city is 2, 3, 4 hours away, and who wants to move out there to get a low-paying job far from decent internet and little or nothing in the way of Amazon Prime and stuff like that? It just, the modern conveniences that we associate with the city are very hard to, they're non-existent in many of these places, and if there's no money to compensate for that, why go and take the job?
Gotcha. And what happens with, and what makes medical or hospital systems, what gets them so often attacked? Is it also that they're weaker, or is it that the stakes are so high when they get compromised, that that ransomware is that it's easier to get people to pay the ransom?
That's part of it, but there's also vendor lock-in that is oftentimes customized, and for their particular environment. So it makes it extremely difficult and extremely expensive to move off to another vendor. And it's because in addition to all the implementation stuff, you have new training things that have to go on, and it seems like there's always something else that takes priority, especially within direct providers. Hospitals are competing with each other on who has the newest equipment. It used to be that you would buy an X-ray system and it would last X number of years, and nowadays you need to have, it's not just X-rays and MRIs. You need to have X-rays, MRIs, CT scanners, PET scanners. You have all of these very high-end, very, very expensive systems. We're talking multi-million-dollar systems, and but now the time that you have to make back your investment, make back the money on your investment, maybe is half of what it used to be. So the capital expenses are going in directions that don't support getting the software upgraded. And if the software is doing its job for now, why worry about upgrading?
It's a good point when I think about it. I mean, are the MRI machines and the CT scanners and so on, are those things that you're not going to replace that often? Are they on the network? Are they on the domain?
Yeah, sometimes on the network, definitely.
Yeah, and a couple of those things to add on to what Jarrod said, and he's spot on. You definitely have on the city government side, you have kind of a dearth of talent. You also have a dearth of kind of modern defense equipment, for the network and for the data, for example. You have, in both cases, in the city government, you have the fact that, one, the city government has to get back into operation. They have no choice other than to get back in operation. So if they can't afford to pay or won't pay, the chances are they have some form of state backup that will kick in to help them out. For hospitals, you have obviously the fact that one, in neither of the case is network security part of their core competency, right? It's not part of their business model to be secure. It should be, but that's not their primary model of how they make money. So as Jarrod said, having the top equipment or the best equipment, as soon as you get into like surgery machines, like the Da Vinci machines or otherwise, you're talking 20, 30, $40 million pieces of equipment. And on top of that, you have the issue of public trust in both of those institutions, right? Because as soon as you realize that, hey, your city has gotten compromised and all city services have shut down, public trust is out the window. Similar with the hospital, as soon as it goes public, that particular hospital, that all their systems are offline, including systems that dispense medication, systems that let people in and out of doors securely, and other things, then that public trust starts to erode. So they are certainly prime targets in the the threshold for getting in is probably lower, and the likelihood that they're going to pay is probably higher.
And just to throw out one other complexity you have there too with local government is you have them supporting this IT group, multiple different small locations. So you have public works, you've got fire stations, you've got the police stations, you've got computers now in each of the police cars, and depending on how they have that configured, they all connect back internally over a VPN, or they're using public connections. And there's that complexity now on top of it that these small IT groups are required to support.
Yeah, actually, I hadn't thought of that as kind of a spider web effect, if you will. Well, Dave, I think this brings us back around to you for your next round.
Okay. So I think my next prediction sort of for the year, and Rob sort of touched on it before, well, my second one that I had was all the new C2 frameworks that are coming out, and there's just so many. I'm seeing one or two new ones coming out every day. Each one of them is a little bit different, but since we already dove into that, come up with another one here, and it's a lot more stuff is going to web applications, as we've been seeing over the years, and mobile apps, and just a lot more misconfigurations within them, because many companies, oh, we need to have a mobile app, and we're going and hiring some local developer, some guy maybe off Facebook Marketplace, off of Craigslist, to come and develop a mobile app for you. Looks good to you, but no one's taking a look under the covers, pay them a couple $100, whatever the going rate is, and you have a new mobile app for whatever you're trying to do. So I think that's going to become much more of a problem on the smaller scale for smaller groups than more so on the larger enterprise level.
Interesting. So essentially, the fact that one, we've democratized the development of the applications, and because of that, we're going to continue to see a proliferation of bad applications. Does that sum it up?
I think so, or just badly written applications, maybe not maliciously written, but just written in a way that's not secure for the way things are being done.
Absolutely. Discussion?
Yeah, I would like to piggyback on that one. And it's not, I don't think it's just going to be the applications themselves. I think it's going to be a lot of the APIs, the calls back and forth to the servers. We're seeing a lot more of those just being pushed out in general to applications that are not secure. And it seems to be one of the most unforgotten portions of the applications, where is it safe on this device? Does it leave anything? Great. And then the server, is the server secured? Great. But they're not really paying attention to how is the data getting from the server to the application? How is the API calls being handled? And what can you do with those APIs? So not only that, the applications themselves, but I think that we're going to see a lot more API-based vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because, if we look at back in the day, we were like, oh, well, we secured the server, we've done whatever we can, essentially with the client, but, we all know that on the client side, that can easily be bypassed. And, so that leaves the API, so if the API itself isn't locked down or restricted, then, it's game over. I remember seeing a presentation last year where they were discussing a lot of data that was essentially being analyzed by people as public data from a maker of a popular fitness app. I'll just leave it at that. But after the outcry where people were able to map CIA locations overseas and other things like that, the company took the web map offline. But they didn't take the API offline or the data. So the data is still there, the API is still valid. So anybody that has access to the API can make those calls and extract that data. So very interesting point, Rob. Any other points on discussion? Okay, so back to Jarrod, if I can. I apologize, I skipped over Jarrod on your predictions. Over to you.
That's okay. I've been talking a lot, so it makes it easy to make that mistake. My first prediction is actually going to be following on the web pieces that Rob and Dave just talked about. The World Wide Web Consortium recently formally adopted the WebAssembly model, and the idea behind WebAssembly is to get native code execution speeds out of code downloaded into the browser. Right now, if you were to do certain things purely in JavaScript, even if it's minified or compiled, it takes a really long time, and JavaScript is just not the most efficient language out there for code execution. Now the options are there for writing code in C or C++, in other languages, and compiling them and pulling them down over into a browser. It's supposed to execute inside of a sandbox that doesn't have access to anything, but as we've seen many times in the past, whether you're running in a sandbox, if you have a virtual machine, if you have a sandbox in a virtual machine, we've seen people come up with various ways to get out of these. And the big challenge here is not so much the issue of the sandboxes. Those are going to get fixed fairly quickly, but at least on a long-term basis. The challenge, though, is how do you detect this stuff that's coming in? Right now, our endpoint security mechanisms are largely geared, still after years of in-memory stuff, they are still largely geared towards what can we detect once it hits once it actually hits the disk. And we've seen a few endpoint solutions that are doing, that have the capability at least of doing periodic memory scans, but those memory scans take a big performance hit. So I think we're going to see a lot of attacks against the sandbox environments, against different browsers, and we're starting to see a proliferation of browsers. Just a couple of years ago, it was largely Internet Explorer, Edge, Firefox, and Chrome. And we now have Vivaldi, we have Brave, we have the Chromium-based Edge that's coming out here in a few weeks. And there are more browsers out there. So it's going to be interesting to see the attacks against these and how, or even whether, the endpoint security solutions evolve to figure out a way of tracking it. Proxies are a possibility, but proxies bring problems when you're talking about HTTPS sites. We've run into this in the past where endpoint solutions are actually become part of the attack because the browser ends up trusting everything that the endpoint solution proxy passes off to it, sort of by necessity because of the way how certificate validation works in HTTPS. They're going to have to evolve because I think short term they might start pointing at the browser manufacturers, or they might start pointing at the users. Well, you're not updating fast enough, you're not getting patches out fast enough. But ultimately, people are going to start asking questions of the endpoint solutions, and it's going to be those that can come up with viable solutions that don't break the chain of trust that are going to win out on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's been bound to happen, and we've kind of seen those cycles over the past couple decades across the board. Discussion? It seems like we're all in agreement there. Rob? back to you for your next kind of round.
Awesome. So this kind of piggybacks on my first prediction of the decline of PowerShell-based malware. And I'm going to say that there's going to be a new language that is going to prevail in the malware scene, and that is Golang. It's already being used, and it's slowly gaining popularity, but I think this will be the year that Golang is really adopted by malware authors due to the fact that you can compile it for Windows, you can compile it for OS X, Linux, BSD, Android phones. So it's basically write once, execute everywhere style of malware. And I just see that being the new hotness for malware authors to use as a language.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Ed Scotus and his team over at CounterHack were all learning it, so that they could create one of their kind of end of the year CTFs a few years back. And I was just wondering, kind of like, one, how ubiquitous is this going to become? And sure enough, within like 6 months, pretty much everybody I knew was learning it and writing little applications in it and taking it from there. So it's only grown from there, I think. Others?
Yeah, it's a really cool language. It's Golang. We had I think 4 of us at InGuardians learned it so that we could create a Kubernetes attack tool because we were thinking about Python, and yet Golang is what Kubernetes is primarily written in, and we could use one of the main Kubernetes libraries. And for me, when I learned it for that, I was like, wow, this is really really neat. It's you get this you get these things, you get something that's great for malware authors, I'm sure, which is when it's very easy to create, fully statically compiled binaries. And that's really nice because now you're just distributing one file and it's actually going to work, that it's not going to end up in dependency hell. But beyond that, as somebody writing code, it's like somebody wanted to give you the kind of speed that you got out of C, but a lot of the kind of comfort of modern languages. And it's a really cool language because it's some of the original C authors who worked on it and designed it and said, okay, these are the things that went wrong. Like we designed C a long time ago. These are some of the things that went wrong. So we're not going to let that happen anymore. And so it's really cool if you can. That's mine. Thanks.
Plus, you could also embed C inside of Go. If you have something that works in C, you could import that inside of Go and then continue writing in Go as well.
Fun. Everybody's going to go out and learn a new language. That's awesome. So I think that's kind of part and parcel with some of the other predictions that we've given here. With the rise of the cloud infrastructure, it's only natural that we go to a language that is more native to that.
Yeah, it's also really cool that it's basically been designed. It's a language that's been designed since after all the computers went multi-core, and so yeah, it's a lot. Honestly, as a software author, it's a lot safer to do concurrency, to use multiple cores in Golang than in so many languages.
I have a question for the group here. with what we saw, in the last couple of years, with kind of this massive deployment of IoT everything, whether it's your internet connected fridge or toaster, or other things, we saw a number of these devices, and by numbers, we're talking about millions of these devices being used in like Mirai, and other kind of botnets or other attack platforms. Uh, do you think we'll still see kind of an increase in using these Internet of things as attack platforms, or is that over with the decade?
I think we'll continue to see them. They're devices people bring in, get them set up in place, and for the most part, set and forget. Once people have things set up, they just keep using it. Eventually, they'll become defunct or no longer supported, and that might be the only time they actually get removed. But in between there, if there's a vulnerability, anything to that effect, it's just there to be taken advantage of. Because as long as the device is working, nobody's going to complain.
Yeah, no,
I agree.
I would.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say on the no longer supported, for us as attackers, things are going to be in use after they're no longer supported until they are noticed or are causing a problem and they can't, and someone realizes the lack of support will break it. But that's, I think that's one of the scariest things for anybody who's bought an early IoT vendors, devices only to see the vendor go out of business, or stay in business but stop being in that entire that entire product area, and say, oh, we don't do IoT anymore, or we don't do whatever it is, light bulbs or ventilation systems or what have you. That things will be unsupported and they will be in use for some time, just like our Windows 95, or not 95, but our Windows XP systems that we see all the time, and we say, oh, that's great, that thing doesn't have patches and I've got some great exploits for it. And that's what we'll be saying about a ton of IoT devices. I mean, the other side of what makes some of that IoT scary for me, is I've spoken with people who have built commercial buildings, and in a lot of commercial buildings, that commercial building gets a lot of its building intelligence systems installed once, and they'll be there for quite a while before they're going to get replaced, or before anyone's going to stop and decide whether they need to be replaced.
Yeah,
That's exactly where I was going to go, Jay. Is the fact that, as more and more IoT things become available and they're getting cheaper and people are starting to adopt them more and more and more, they're pretty much set and forget device. You put it on your network and you don't patch it because you forget it's there. It's convenience. And so specifically the early adopters of certain products, are going to be more vulnerable because they're not going to get the patches, because unless they actually involve those in their patch management system.
and frankly, as long as the fridge is still working, they're not going to care. I mean, they most likely will never know that the fridge is compromised, for example. It reminds me of a.
Well, I think that's what led to the Mirai botnet.
Yeah.
Right. You
absolutely.
had a ton of devices that were, it's like that IP camera. I installed it, and once I installed it, I never thought about it again. Like, I mean, it's in use, but I haven't, but either the homeowner in the personal case, or the business, or the business IT staff, or business whoever it is that installed them or paid for them to be installed, is going back and logging into the admin page for the IP camera, or for the whole set of IP cameras, and now they're part of a botnet, and now they're part of the botnet that's sent to the largest traffic spike ever.
Yep. No, absolutely. It reminds me of a great science fiction book written by Elizabeth Bear. I believe it was called Shocked. And the premise of the book was essentially that the protagonist had a bunch of wetware implants installed, but they were 10 or 15 years old, so they needed to be upgraded, replaced. Their firmware needed to be updated and so forth. And it was just, that was the first time that I had thought about it's like, oh crud, we're going to get to a point where we're going to have all these devices, and just getting them updated is going to be a massive chore, much less in current situation identifying which ones they are. Jay, do you have another prediction to share with us?
I think we've hit all of mine. I think we've had some overlap already. Yeah, let's see.
Well, while you think about it, let's go to Jarrod here for your second round.
So I'm going to take, we've been talking about a lot of technical things. I'm going to take a little detour off to the non-technical side of things. One of the things that we saw happen recently was the passage in California of the California Privacy Protection Act, I think is what it's called. And it's modeled to some degree on the European Union's GDPR. And I think that we're seeing just the beginning of privacy laws, expansion of privacy laws, not just inside the US, and that'll probably be on a state-by-state basis at first. So you're going to run into the sort of conflicting laws about it. But I think we're going to start seeing it on an international scale as well, and complying with that is going to be a challenge. But I think from what I've been seeing in some of the discussions over the last year or so, is that while most of these privacy laws and data breach laws, they have a civil approach, there may be some fines associated with loss of control of data, but I think ultimately we're going to start seeing discussions of criminal penalties where those who fail to properly protect the data may be looking at individual fines and possibly even some jail time. I think there's also going to be a tendency to try and put some teeth into it so that it's easier for prosecutors to put the blame on high-level executives for not allowing the companies or for not directing the companies to put forth the necessary effort. I don't know that we're going to see a lot of changes in 2020, but I think the discussion is going to ramp up. I expect that we're probably going to see at least one or two more states follow California's lead. We may start seeing other countries follow the lead of GDPR and start locking things down. So it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to bring pressure in from a number of levels. But it's basically going to change the risk acceptance equations. Whereas before, maybe the risk acceptance for some companies was, well, this is going to cost us, $100,000 in legal fees and maybe a little bit of a black eye in the press for a little while. That may change up where, like GDPR does a percentage of revenues. So that fine suddenly can get very, very big, very quickly. And instead, that loss of control of data may cost millions of dollars in civil fines, plus potentially, and that may be from multiple directions. You might get it from a couple of different states, plus the EU, plus whatever other countries go for it. So the impetus to start implementing some better technical controls over data and individual user data privacy is going to grow, and we're going to have to learn to keep up, not just from a technical level, but from a policy level to lock things down a bit better.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Jarrod. One of the things that first came to mind to me when I first saw the GDPR regulations being essentially explained, it was before they actually went into effect. The first thing I thought to myself is, like, this would be a phenomenal weapon. Meaning that it wouldn't be very difficult to weaponize the GDPR against companies because of the substantial fines that are associated with this. If I recall correctly, at least in the initial implementation, the fines, for GDPR violations were based on your profit numbers or your gross revenue, either way. But still, knowing that an attacker could conduct serious economic warfare against an organization like that.
And it could potentially change things up on how stuff goes with ransomware, where if the attacker figures that you're facing a $20 million fine, well, maybe $1 million doesn't sound so bad. So instead of a $50,000 or $100,000 ransom, as we commonly see today, even on some fairly large targets, it pushes up into the multi-million-dollar range. Cyber insurance is going to probably be fairly reluctant to cover that level, or at least if you have that coverage, that's going to be even more expense. And but it's going to change the risk calculus all the way through. So do you want to pay the $1 million quietly, or do you want to risk a $20 million fine from one organization, or from one state government, as opposed to what could possibly be coming down from multiple state and national governments?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the one thing that this was one of my predictions that kind of dovetails into this is that what I foresee, maybe not in 2020, but in the very near future, is I see large government entities getting compromised, and the data that those large government entities have been collecting on their own citizens getting exposed, leading to massive kind of pushback against those agencies. So for a light example, let's just say that the NSA got hacked, and one of their data stores that contained a lot of information about American citizens got published online. Something along those lines would be enormous. There probably isn't enormous amounts of regulation that would cover it, but the pushback would be tremendous. Okay, so we're at about an hour and 7 or so. What I'd like to do is go to kind of each of you, just to kind of maybe sum up your thoughts. If you have any additional thoughts to say it then. So why don't we start off with Dave?
So yeah, continuing from before, we'll see more of the same, just a growing trend from last year and what we've seen over the course of last year, still this year, just a growing course of that, of cloud services just not being secured properly, as well as just more proliferation of insecure coded mobile apps.
Jay?
More proliferation of cloud native technologies, Kubernetes especially, but containerization in general, and thus a whole lot more for us to all do on the security side, whether we're learning to defend it, learning to attack it, or just knowing that's where our data is.
Awesome. Rob?
Yeah, due to the large number of PowerShell frameworks and .NET frameworks, the decrease in PowerShell malware in the wild over the course of 2020. Due to that fact, I predict that we'll also see more esoteric and older languages used to create droppers and an increase of Golang malware.
Excellent. Jarrod?
I think we're at an interesting confluence where the security mechanisms that we have available by default are growing and they are getting better. At the same time, the number of platforms that we have to work with at any given time is also expanding quickly with IoT, with massive growth, as Jay mentioned, in containerization. The number of devices that any individual is using throughout the day It's going to be a challenge to keep up with all of the changes that are coming up, but we don't really have a whole lot of choice. If we don't make the decision to keep up with that, we're going to have laws pushed on us to make sure that we do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, to kind of quote my really good friend Ed Scotus, we live in the golden age of hacking. We live in the golden age of defending. You know, so you know, I think that what you've seen here, you know, in the last hour, is that you know, we have many different avenues. You know, if we want to specialize on the infosec side, you know, if we want to manage these things, these efforts, if we want to pursue new kind of languages to learn or environments to test, you know, I think that we have enormous amounts of opportunity. You know, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded, so you'll receive in about 15-20 minutes an email where you can go and download the recording to re-listen to it. I'd like to thank you very much. For next year, InGuardians is switching it up just a little bit. You know, we're planning on doing one webinar per quarter, and we're going to be focusing those webinars on training. So that should be a lot of fun. Make sure that you take a moment to sign up for our weekly executive briefing. In fact, one of the topics that we discussed today is going to be the topic of next week's briefing. So fun stuff there. You can always keep track of our webinars and our training opportunities by following the links on the slides. Again, thank you so very much for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.